Okay, and we are ready to get going. Take it away. Bill, hold on for just a second because you are muted.
You're muted.
Okay, are we good?
We're good.
All right. So thank you very much, Lisa, for that introduction. And thank you also to the Greenfield Public Library for sponsoring this event. Hopefully we have a few things that we can share that'll be worthwhile to everybody who's tuning in tonight. I'm going to hit my share screen button because we have a PowerPoint presentation. Whoop, it says, is that working?
You should be able to do it now.
Whoops. I guess I need to hit my PowerPoint first. Okay, I guess we're ready to go. So we'll cover as much as we can about Asher Benjamin's life and work in the time that we have. We want to make sure we have some time at the end for some questions and answers. So I'm going to get right to it. I've jotted down a few things that I think would be worthwhile to cover tonight. And the first is the question that I've been getting from everybody I know who's interested in the book, and friends and even family. You know, who was this guy Asher Benjamin, and why did you choose to write about him? So I'll just give you the brief answer to that. I started about 4 years ago writing a short history of architecture in my hometown, which is Walpole, New Hampshire. And of course, I came across Benjamin. I didn't really do a deep dive on him, but came to know him a little bit. So a little over a year ago, when I was thinking about another writing project, I thought about Benjamin. So I thought, okay, the logical place to start would be to get my hands on a biography of Asher Benjamin. And I looked everywhere I could, you know, in libraries, went to Amazon. I struck out and finally came to the realization that there was not a biography done of Asher Benjamin, which really astounded me. I certainly had come to the conclusion that he was an important figure in early American architecture in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. So I began thinking about whether I could do it myself. So that's how I launched myself into it. I basically spent the pandemic last winter reading, writing, and researching about Asher Benjamin. So that's the short answer to how I got to write a biography of Asher Benjamin. Some other things that we'll cover very briefly for the uninitiated, a brief overview of American architecture in the 18th and early 19th centuries, just so we can identify certain characteristics about for each of the styles that are relevant to us, and certainly that would have been known to and relevant to Asher Benjamin, Georgian, Federal, and Greek Revival styles. Whoops, why won't this advance? Oh, there it is. And then we'll spend most of our time looking at the architecture of Asher Benjamin, first in the Connecticut Valley, where he's from. The first 10 years or so of his career were spent in the Connecticut Valley, in various parts of the Connecticut Valley. And then eventually his move to Boston in 1803, which launched him in a different direction in his architectural career. We cannot omit his impact as an author. I don't know if we'd actually be talking about Asher Benjamin if it wasn't for this aspect of his career. He did something really extraordinary in writing the first architectural handbook by a native-born American at the age of 24, which to me was rather surprising and amazing. And finally, we'll wrap up with a brief overview of, what was his legacy and what was important about him and what should we know about him as an architect, author, and artist. So first of all, a brief overview. This is the Chase House in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, very typical mid-century, 18th century house. You can begin by seeing the gambrel roof, which was characteristic of most houses in that period, most sizable houses at any rate. Two-story rectangular block, corner coins, double sash windows, a beautifully segmented central doorway, and a 5-bay facade that is symmetrically arranged. Those are all things that would have been characteristic. And many of those are, of course, based in their classical knowledge of architecture in the 18th century. We moved to Boston. This is the Otis House. We'll have more to say about its architect, Charles Bulfinch, in a little bit. But you can see there are some similarities, some things carried over from the Georgian. Specifically the facade, 5 bays, symmetrically arranged, a beautiful central doorway, but we see some changes as well. One of the things that we see is the roof line has come down. This is a hip roof as opposed to the gambrel roof that we saw previously. Instead of a large central chimney, we have two chimneys that have been pushed to the sides, pushed to the ends. This, of course, makes for a more efficient use of the interior space of the house. And on the facade, we see it's a smoother facade. There, for example, there aren't any cornices over the window. We see granite lintels. Another thing characteristic of the Federal, or ADAMESQUE, as it sometimes is referred to, is over the doorway we see, instead of just simple semicircular fan light, we see elliptical forms. This happens sometimes as well in the Palladian windows, as well as windows that appear sometimes above the doorway. And finally, I've just gone to my own hometown for this example of a Greek Revival building. We can see it's been the orientation of the house has been totally changed. The narrow end of the house faces forward. We're back to a gable roof. And of course, the most distinguishing characteristic is the front portico, which is supported by, in this case, Doric columns. And not all Greek Revival homes necessarily have this kind of a portico, but the Parthenon is the prototype for the Greek Revival. We also see a couple of other changes. For example, the doorway is not in the center of the facade. It's been pushed to the side. So that's a little bit of an overview of the different styles that Asher Benjamin not only would have been familiar with, but would have worked in. He worked mostly in the Federal and the Greek Revival. So what about some background on Asher Benjamin's early life? To say the least, information was sparse on his early life. But contrary to what many people thought up until the 1950s, it was thought that he grew up in Greenfield. And in the 1950s, a researcher realized that that was incorrect. He actually grew up in a small town in northwestern Connecticut, right on the Massachusetts border, called Heartland. It probably was a town of just a couple hundred people. I can't even imagine. One of the really surprising things about Asher Benjamin and all that he knew and all that he accomplished as such a young man, he couldn't have had much of a formal education, in this very rural, out of the way town, isolated town in northwestern Connecticut. But the fact that he was able to accomplish so much so quickly tells us he must have been a man of some talent. He moved from, at 17, he took his apprenticeship in Suffield, about 20 miles to the east of the town he grew up in, right on the Connecticut River. So this is a little, we can see where he grew up in Heartland. This little map provides a little bit of an orientation to us. And we can see Suffield to the east, just beyond the jog, I think, as they call it. Downriver, we see Hartford, and he would have an important commission in Hartford before he would begin moving upriver to Greenfield, Deerfield, and would actually have a major commission in Northampton. From there, he would almost surprisingly move further north, really into the wilderness in the 1790s to Windsor, Vermont. So we'll be looking at each of those spots. He apprenticed under a man by the name of Thomas Hayden, or at least we believe he did. And Thomas Hayden had the job of doing the addition onto this house. This is a house in Suffield, Connecticut. And Asher Benjamin's job for the Oliver Phelps house was to work. We're not exactly sure what he did on the interior, but if you look at this house, the original block is to the left and the addition is to the right. He may have worked inside on this house, but what he is best known for is the carving of the Ionic capitals in this picture. And you can see this. He had no guidance on this from anybody except a guidebook that had been given to him by his apprentice, Thomas Hayden. The guidebook was by an English architect by the name of William Payne. The fact that he was able to work this out himself tells us that he somehow had acquired skill in mathematics and geometry that, you know, you would think a formal education was needed for. But nonetheless, he was starting to build a little bit of a reputation because of this. And he was only 21 years old at the time, but it did help him get his next commission, which was downriver at Hartford. This is the old Connecticut State House, which was not the old State House at that time. In 1794, he had a commission to construct a spiral staircase inside of this building. Now, that in and of itself was important, but what's going to be most important for the future is that this building was a commission of Charles Bulfinch. Charles Bulfinch was transforming architecture in all of New England. He was, of course, in Boston, but he was helping to change the way people thought about style from the Georgian to what would come to be known as the Federal or ADAMESQUE. I say ADAMESQUE because it comes from Robert Adam, the English architect, who really helped everybody to rethink their ideas about classical architecture. In general, we're going to say that Federal architecture or Adam-inspired architecture was a little bit quieter, a little bit more delicate, not as bold or as striking as Georgian architecture. Many of the same forms, many of the same moldings, but different in other ways. For example, as you look at the bottom row here of windows, you can see kind of a recessed arch. You know, this is something that comes in with the Federal style. We also see, and we saw it on the OTIS house as well, as you progress upward, the windows go from tall to medium, and then the top story, the third story, the windows are smaller. So these, among other things, are things more characteristic of the Federal style. So Benjamin has these two commissions to his credit by the time he's about 22 years old. Very slowly, he is building a reputation in the Connecticut Valley. the title here of this section is Benjamin Goes Tramping. Well, tramping simply means that if we think about, trying to be a builder in the 18th or early 19th century, staying in one spot, especially for a young builder, was going to be very difficult. There just wasn't enough work. So quite often, young builders and house rights, they'd have to move from place to place. And he realizes that there's probably a lot more work for him upriver in the Connecticut Valley in Greenfield. However, Charles Bulfinch has him thinking. He's impressed by Bulfinch. Although Bulfinch was not present, the plans for the old Connecticut State House were his. So he decides he needs to know more about Charles Bulfinch. So before he actually goes and settles in Greenfield, he goes to Boston and he goes to Pittsfield, Massachusetts. In Boston, he comes across a project that Bulfinch is designing called the Tontine Crescent. Bulfinch is looking to totally transform the urban townhouse experience. He builds a crescent-shaped series of townhouses, 480 feet, in a sort of a crescent shape or elliptical shape, if you will, half ellipse, which means each apartment or townhouse had 30 feet of frontage. And where does he get this idea? He gets it from Robert Adam. Now, Charles Bulfinch, unlike Benjamin, had lots of advantages. He came from a wealthy Boston family. Father was I believe he was a physician. So he was educated at the Boston Latin School, went to Harvard. Then after college, he got sent overseas for 2 years for what was popularly known in the 18th century as the Grand Tour. Not many Americans took the Grand Tour, but many Englishmen did, Robert Adam amongst them. So when Adam went, he came back with many ideas about classical architecture, and he applied them in his own work in London and throughout England. He went to Bath, England as well. And this is where Bulfinch went and observed a very similar type structure constructed by Adam. Now, as you look at this, I want you to try to think about and remember what we saw with the Otis house. Observe the central pavilion here of the Tontine Crescent. All right, the arched window decorated, the Palladian window, and there was a highly decorated door in the middle. And we go back to the Otis house, and we can see quite clearly that Bulfinch was very much inspired by that form of decoration. So there's a transmission of ideas that took place first from Italy to England, and then from England to Boston. Now, from Boston, Benjamin travels all the way across the state of Massachusetts to the very western edge in Pittsfield. And Bulfinch had designed a church in Pittsfield. It may not look much like much to us today, but this church would be the prototype for the New England church, country church, for the next 25 years, next quarter of a century. The whole idea of meeting houses and churches was changing. Typically, the meeting house would see the door on the long side with the pulpit directly across. And usually meeting houses were financed by entire communities because they were used for more than just religious services. Town meetings, a variety of other town activities could take place inside one of these meeting houses. The church, however, was financed by a particular congregation, right? I mean, a Catholic church is supported by Catholics, right? In a Catholic congregation, and so on and so forth. We see that the entrance to a church is no longer on the long side in the middle. It's on the narrowest side, and there's a porch right? That's been added to this, right? And of course, the familiar church tower. So this becomes, again, the prototype. Now, Benjamin sees this and he is totally taken with it and impressed by it. And this is going to, he's going to take Bulfinch's model and turn it into something of a prototype for the rest of New England. So we're going to take time out here to just examine Benjamin and what he did as an author. So even at the age of 23 or so, he has to be thinking about putting some of these things down on paper and actually writing a book. One of the things he realizes is that American country builders, they can't afford the English guidebooks. They're too big, they're too unwieldy, they're expensive. So he decides it makes sense for him to design and create a book that's going to be useful for American builders, specifically American country builders. So he publishes The Country Builder's Assistant in Greenfield in 1797. This was going to be the first of 7 architectural guidebooks that he would write. This is probably the most famous plate from his first book, and it is based on the church that we just looked at. And if you look in the upper left-hand corner, you can see the facade with the porch that is kicked out. And then you can see the tower, right? The tower is not exactly like the tower that Bulfinch created. It's got 3 tiers instead of 2, all right? It's a little fancier. It's got urns, Grecian urns, which will become kind of a signature of Benjamin's work. You'll see them in several locations, several places. And then you can see the rest of the church that's laid out. So this was plate 27, plan for a meeting house. And this would be, this would be in play for several decades following its publication. If you want a great example of an existing Bulfinch / Benjamin church, go to Bennington, Vermont. This is the church that we find there. And you can see all the characteristics that we just mentioned. This was probably built by a fellow by the name of Lavius Fillmore, a master builder who worked in Western New England. And you can see the three doors at the street level, the very, very extravagant Palladian window just above it. And in the first tier of the tower, there are Palladian windows on all 3 sides. And that's what it was called for. However, there are also little changes too. And I say this because one of the things that sometimes Benjamin was accused of was of simply copying Bulfinch. And he really didn't. He was inspired by Bulfinch, but rarely did he copy Bulfinch. There are probably 50 to 60 versions of this church throughout Western New England and Southern New Hampshire. Places like Troy, New Hampshire, Newport, Peterborough, all have churches that were probably from the plans of Asher Benjamin. So I became very interested in the course of looking at his work of the way that information was passed, from its genesis, from the beginning to how it actually wound up in Western New England. So we go back to Robert Adam again. And this was a building that Charles Bulfinch, when he was in London on his tour, he would have observed this building. It's called the Royal Society of Arts in London. And you can see all the characteristic things that we've talked about, the very low-pitched roof. In back of that low-pitched pediment was a relatively flat roof. And we see in the middle of that pediment something very characteristic of the Federal, and that is what's called a swag or a festoon, a very, very common Federal decoration. We see on either side of or in between the columns, we see decorative panels, right, in elliptical form. We see a very elaborate Palladian window and a very elaborate central doorway on the street level. So this obviously stuck with, this impression made a big impression on Bulfinch and stuck with him, and he brought this information home. So when he returned to Boston, he was commissioned by a wealthy family called the Coolidge family, which incidentally, apparently Bulfinch's sister had married into. And they want him to create a building or a residence that is going to be bigger and grander and reflect the recent taste in classical architecture. And we can clearly see the Coolidge house, which no longer exists, but this drawing of it still does. We can clearly see that he was inspired by the Royal Society of Arts building, and this is the drawing of it. So Benjamin, when he went to Boston probably in about 1792 or 3, he would have seen the Coolidge house. So when he goes to Greenfield, he actually is commissioned to do a house in Northampton by a wealthy lawyer by the name of Samuel Hinckley. And this house doesn't look like much to us today. It's the only picture that we have. This house was demolished about 1904, 1905. But the Hinckley house has all the characteristics that we have been talking about, and is clearly inspired by what he saw in the Coolidge house. We have that central pediment, centered pediment. We have the 5-bay and a very smooth facade. We have the rectangular block with the chimneys pushed to the ends. Unfortunately, we have a lot of shrubbery around the front of the house and the front portico that prevents us from seeing the doorway, but we get the idea, right? So we've seen, something, Adam take his inspiration going all the way back to his time in Italy, and from Italy to England, from England to Boston, and from Boston, we see the Federal or Adam style come to the Connecticut Valley. This was the first Federal style house done in the Connecticut Valley. So we move back to where he's actually residing, and he builds 2 large high-style Federal mansions in Greenfield. Of course, anybody from Greenfield who's in our audience tonight knows this house. This is the Coleman Hollister house. And what I can say about this house is it was probably the grandest, largest house, in the entire, probably in all of Western New England at the time. But what it tells us is that, Benjamin is still kind of in this experimental stage. Everything he knows about decoration in the Federal style, he has applied to this house. We see the 2 chimneys, not to the ends, but certainly not in the center either. And on the facade, we see engaged pilasters that go all the way to the roof. We see an elegant Palladian window centered over the front door. We see rectangular panels with swags across the front between each of the pilasters. The portico you see there was not original to the house. It kind of prevents us from seeing that really beautiful front door, but we get the idea. So this is from the interior of the house, and you can see that this is a beautiful spiral staircase. Apparently, this is kind of a side note, apparently Benjamin may have been the only builder architect in New England at the time who knew how to construct a spiral staircase in the way he did. Several decades later, he gave credit to an Englishman by the name of Peter Nicholson for informing him in his guidebook about how he could do this. So he constructs this. This is inside the Coleman house. A building familiar, of course, to everybody watching tonight from Greenfield. This, of course, is today the Greenfield Public Library, but was the Levitt House, also a very wealthy lawyer. Didn't, you know, he saw what was being done and he decided Benjamin was his guy. And we see all the same characteristics that we just went through. The facade is a little plainer, but we see wings on this that are being applied with arcades. And if we look at one of the 1805 edition of the Country Builder's Assistant, we can see a very similar looking construction here, not exactly the same. We don't see, for example, the Palladian window in the middle. And these look like octagonal wings, but the whole concept of the wings is present here. And of course, the rectangular block for the central part of the house. So you would think that he would be anxious maybe to move on, but not necessarily in the Connecticut Valley, but he was being recruited by the town fathers of Windsor, Vermont. Vermont had only been settled for about the last 25 to 30 years. Nobody could settle there until the French and Indian War had been settled in the early 1760s. But Windsor were apparently intent on having the best possible architect, and Benjamin was it. They needed a meeting house. So Benjamin went to Windsor with plans for a meeting house, which still exists, and here it is. Unfortunately, what we're looking at, this is the Old South Meeting House, 1798 or so. Unfortunately, the facade has been changed from the original, but what is original is the entire tower. And you can see he has added a fourth tier to this. And once again, if we look in that second tier, we see these niches. And inside those arched niches are Grecian urns. And then on top of the little banister we see here, urns once again. So the Old South Meeting House was probably the largest, grandest house in the upper Connecticut Valley. And it convinces him that although he's not living there in 1798, 2 years later he goes and he actually lives in Windsor. He constructs at least 2, possibly 3 large houses. This was the Fullerton House, 1799 or 1800. And if you think back about the Coleman House, look at the facade of that house and compare with the facade of this house, we see once again, very, very similar decoration. What it tells me is that Benjamin, as an architect and as a design architect, he really hadn't hit his full maturity yet. He was not using much discretion about what sort of decoration he was adding. And he knew he probably needed to be in the presence of somebody that could help him to learn that. And that was going to take him, obviously, only in one place. And that was he needed to work in the orbit of Charles Bulfinch. So he's going to take himself and his small family in 1802, eventually would become quite large, and he's going to take them to Boston. I want you to look. I'm going to show you the first 2 buildings. These were 2 of the first, not the 2 first, but two of the first buildings he constructed in Boston. This is the African Meeting House. We can see the blind arch. We can see the tall arched windows. And he's working in brick now, right? He had worked a little bit in brick. There was the Stebbins House in Deerfield and the Deerfield Academy. But he's in an urban setting now, which is much different. Down the street and over the hill on Beacon Hill is the Charles Street Meeting House. So you can again see a pretty clear change in his approach, right, to decoration. Think about the Coleman House. Think about the Fullerton House. We don't see any of that decoration on here. It's just a beautiful, smooth, clean, austere, restrained sense of decoration. So he's now, you know, in the air. He's not working with Charles Bulfinch, but he's aware of Bulfinch and the way Bulfinch goes about his work. And we see a very different sort of approach to decoration, much more restrained. So we see the maturing of Bulfinch as a federal style or ADAMESQUE architect. However, this is the urban townhouse, and Benjamin can probably take credit for revolutionizing the urban townhouse. This is on Beacon Street. He worked in and around Beacon Hill as that neighborhood was really just beginning. And we see all the decoration that we saw even on some of his country houses like the Coleman House being applied here. These are actually two townhouses, 54 and 55 Beacon Street. You can see the doorways side by side. One goes to the right, one goes to the left. And we also see the graduated window heights as you go higher. But one thing that I think he probably brought to Boston is the bowed front, which today is very common when you walk the streets of Boston. Apartments have these bowed fronts all over the place. It's fairly common. It wasn't common up until Benjamin. By 1809, things have kind of gone badly. For Benjamin, for Bulfinch, Bulfinch is in financial ruin. Benjamin can't get enough work anymore. The idea of being a full-time architect is kind of going away, and he's thinking about other ways that he's going to have to make a living. But in the meantime, he gets a huge commission, and it's to create something called the Exchange Coffee House. It would easily be the largest building in Boston. And we only have, of course, a drawing of it today. As you can see, it was seven stories tall. It was a huge building. And in an age before electricity and before elevators, and it probably was not very practical. About $200,000 was budgeted for this house. This wasn't a house, excuse me. The actual bill wound up being over $500,000, which in 1810, 1809 was an awful lot of money. So Benjamin took a lot of criticism for that. You can also imagine in a building this size, having to go up 7 floors to a hotel room or to a function room of some sort really was not very practical. So it didn't matter how well he finished it inside, it didn't work. The building burned in 1818 or 1819, and it really kind of ruined all the good credit and reputation that he had built up really sort of went down the drain with this building. So he found himself looking for work. He decides, well, I can't be a full-time architect. He opens a hardware store, sells paint. Not what he really wants to do, but he's got a growing family. By this time, he probably has like 5 children, and he needs money. He did, however, accept commissions for buildings outside of Boston while in this period. To me, he did some of his most interesting work in this period. This is the Alexander House in Springfield, Mass. It's beautiful. It's got a double portico in front. If you look inside the portico, it's completely filled with glass. So beautiful. It's corner coins. But there's one really unusual thing about it. If you look at the facade, it's missing something. it's missing a front door. This had to be something very, very different for his time. The doors, if you look to the extreme right-hand side, you can see a little portico where you would enter in the back. Newport, Rhode Island. He didn't have a lot of commissions in Rhode Island, but in Newport, the building not on the corner, not that US hotel, but right next to it to the left, is the Rhode Island Union Bank. And you can see the very, very high and steep blind arches and very smooth, clear front with wings. He got a lot of praise and credit for this commission. Unfortunately, that building does not exist anymore. So by 1825, even his paint store is not doing well, and he's got to bail himself out financially. So in Nashua, New Hampshire, the mill culture is beginning to take shape, and he is recruited to become a mill agent in Nashua. Stylistically, something else is happening. The federal is giving way to the Greek revival. One of the first things he's asked to do is to design a church. And if you look closely at this picture, which is not great, a little clearer on the left than the right, you can see the outlines of a Greek portico, which means this would have been Asher Benjamin's first Greek revival or Grecian design. This is the Olive Street Church. Unfortunately, does not exist. There's another church that was done. We're not sure if it was actually Benjamin's commission or not. I explain the whole story behind it in the book, but I don't really have time to explain it here. But it seems like it could have been by Benjamin, but we just don't have documentation. The building that we just looked at was identified when they saw this blueprint in his second book, The American Builder's Companion, and you can see the very unusual octagonal front of the church. And we go back here, you can kind of see how it flares to the side. So that octagonal shape is what sort of gave us a clue that this was, in fact, Asher Benjamin's church. So by 1828, he's made his money. He's ready to go back to Boston. But when he goes back, the Greek revival is in full bloom. And he actually has a colleague by the name of Alexander Paris. That's with two R's, P-A-R-R-I-S. And Paris is commissioned to create Quincy Market. And we've all seen this building. This is the quintessential Greek structure, right? The Greek temple. This is what Greek architecture is all about. Supposedly Benjamin had a hand in this, but I can't really, based on some of his other designs, I really have my doubts. We can see he attempts to create, this was one of his first Greek commissions, a very large house in Millbury, Mass. If you take away the Greek portico here, I think what we're left with is pretty much a federal style house. So he was really having trouble letting go of the federal style. He said he was an advocate of the Greek, but I don't know if I actually believe him in this very early period. He really struggled, overcoming that. However, there is a great irony, and we're just about ready to finish this up. There's a great irony to his career. For all the financial troubles that he has, he went bankrupt, blah, 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 he couldn't get commissions. He writes a book on the Greek revival. That book would have 19 printings in 21 years. I won't say it made him wealthy, but it certainly made him and his family financially secure. Yet at the same time, the federal was really his best style, and he was a very reluctant stylist when it came to the Greek revival. He did redeem himself. Probably his best Greek revival building is today. You may recognize it if you've been to it. This is the Charles Street Playhouse. This was originally a church. Like the Exchange Coffee House, it was a multifunctional building. The street level here was supposed to have, it was for retail shops. And above that and in back was an 800-seat church. But you can see the in antis ionic columns, right, between the two pilasters, and again, working in brick here. This was really right towards the end of his tenure. He was about 68 years old by this time and probably ready to, to call it a day. We can see this was the design that showed up in his 6th book called The Builder's Companion. And you can see clearly the facade design that we see here, all right, and then here. So, what should we take from Asher Benjamin? What should we remember about him? First, I think his impact on the Connecticut Valley, I mean, we have to remember the Connecticut Valley was in the late 18th and early 19th century was really very isolated from the urban areas on the coast. He helped to bring the Connecticut Valley into a more sophisticated sort of existence, artistically and architecturally, and in other ways as well. He became a leading architect in Boston right alongside Charles Bulfinch. Boston became a centerpiece for the federal design, federal style, and he was the first native-born American to publish an architectural guidebook. And he was certainly, his guidebooks wound up all over the country, in places like Mississippi and Ohio, and you can go to those places and see designs by Asher Benjamin, even though he never went there. So for any of you who are from the Greenfield, Deerfield area, this is the only known likeness we have of Asher Benjamin. It's in the museum in Deerfield, of historic Deerfield. So go take a look sometime.
So Bill, thank you very much. That was really fascinating.
Thank you very much.
It was really interesting to hear a lot of that. I've seen a number of those buildings, not just the ones in Greenfield and Deerfield, without realizing that they were his. Yeah, which is really fascinating to see.
And there are others too that you may not realize as well, but
so that was really interesting. So we're going to open it up to questions now. If you want to stop sharing your screen, we can see more of the people who are in the room and see who's got questions.
Should I hit escape or should I stop share?
Yes.
Okay, there we go.
There we go. So now we should have a pretty good view of most of the people that are here. So if anybody's got a question, feel free to raise your hand and unmute yourself, and I'm sure Bill will call on you. Russ?
Yeah, hi. Sorry, I dozed off in the middle. Just
sorry about that.
Nothing about you. Nothing about you. It was just my being tired at this
like one
time.
of my students.
But, one of the earlier houses that you showed a picture of with the two chimneys at the far sides. And I remember you saying, well, it was efficient for sharing space.
The Otis house, I think, maybe?
Maybe.
Yeah, okay.
But I thought, as far as heating the space, that's a miserable design.
Yeah, I couldn't really tell you. I'm not enough of an engineer to know how heating systems were changing, because I think some things were probably changing with respect to heat. I've heard, for example, by that time that sometimes they used tubes that came that heating tubes that would radiate heat in rooms, and they would construct these
Okay.
tubes. So, but I'm not an authority on that by any
Yeah.
stretch of the imagination. But you can imagine that central chimney. That was where they would want like a stairway to the second floor.
Correct.
You
Yeah.
know, and now they could
Yeah.
do that, you know,
Yeah.
unobstructed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And one more, that 7-story building,
Yeah.
Austin. Didn't anybody have any input to him? Like, what the hell are you doing? Who wants to go way up there? I mean, was there something, was there use for that building, as far as you know, that would include the entire building at one time?
There were three functions. It was a multi-purpose building that Boston and most major cities were probably in need of by that time.
Yeah.
Because they were growing so quickly. It was a place for business to get
Yeah.
men off the street who were doing their business on the street and bring them inside. It was a place for retail shops and restaurants, and it was a place for a hotel. And there were function rooms, of course.
Yeah.
So, but you know, who wants to travel up 7 floors? And apparently, it was in a very awkward space in Boston. It wasn't a
Yeah.
great lot, and there was apparently it got very, you know, some rooms that didn't have sunshine. You know, the sun facing it were very dark. You know,
Yeah.
it wasn't that the building wasn't done well. It's all those other factors that probably nobody really thought of beforehand that caused it to not be successful.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. And did he do any houses that were not grand? I mean, that were
Yes.
modest?
Yeah. For example, the Stebbins house, which is in historic Deerfield.
Okay.
You know, I mean, it's kind of it's a nice, you know, rectangular 2-story brick house, but
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
nearly on the scale of the houses, you know, that we've seen. But he was trying to build his reputation, you know, in that early period. So those large
Build
houses.
them up.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks a
I
lot.
don't have a
Thank you, Russ.
question for Bill,
Hi.
but I have a comment, which is that's been an enlightening and interesting presentation about Asher, and I'm glad to hear about him.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for telling
Thank
us.
you, Bill. Anybody
Joseph?
else?
I think Joseph has a question.
Hi, Bill. Thanks. This is great. Two questions. What the staircase? I took a snapshot of that staircase. The interior is just absolutely beautiful. Was he known for his interior work as much as exterior work? And the second question is, what about offspring? Do we know anything about his heirs or the people that followed after him?
Yes. He had 8 children, and
Wow.
you know, there's a story, and I'll go into it just briefly now. When he was in Nashua, I mentioned there was a second church that still exists, by the way, that we're not sure belonged to him, and it would, and it's in the Greek style, and you know, it seems rather unlikely that he wouldn't have, you know, been the architect behind that. But I actually had the sense to try to find out something about his personal life at that time, and found out that his 22-year-old son died in December of 1826, really just when that church would have been under design and be ready to be constructed. So it's pure speculation that personal that personal situation may have prevented him from being more involved in building that church. And I'm sorry, the first part of that question, Joe, was, oh, the staircases, internal. He was, the building the spiral staircase was definitely a signature of his. I mean, that's what he was hired to do in the old Connecticut State House as well. That unfortunately does not exist anymore. I can't speak to a lot more, but I can tell you if you go to the historic Deerfield Museum, there is a mantle of right in their main lobby is an actual mantle from a chimney mantle that it was designed by him, and it's got the swags and the federal decoration all over it that yells Asher Benjamin based on what we know about him. So I can't really tell you a whole lot more about his interior design than that, but yes, the staircase was definitely a signature of his.
And it looks like we have a question from Sherry Clark. Sherry, do you want to unmute? And I saw you had the hand raised. Sherry?
I did not have a question. I just want to say how wonderful it was.
Oh, thank you so much, Sherry. Appreciate it.
Is there time for me to ask one more question?
Let's see if anybody else has any questions first, Russ, since you have already gone. Anybody
Yeah.
else? Okay, I think you've got time for one more, and then we'll probably be wrapping up.
Okay. The library building, the Levitt Hovey House. When he built it, did it have the wings then, or were those added on later?
I believe they were part of the original building. Yeah.
Now that's interesting because our understanding is that they were added on later.
It could be. How much later, I'm not sure. He built that in what, 1790?
1797.
Okay. 1797. The design that I showed you
Yeah.
was published in 1805. It was not published in the first edition of the Country Builder's Assistant. So it may be that he or somebody else came back, sometime later and added those wings. So I didn't see anything that said, I mean, so much of the research is incomplete, but I didn't see anything that said it wasn't. Now, it may have simply been done, after 1805 when, he published that drawing in the fourth edition of the Country Builder's Assistant.
Because we're pretty sure that what is currently the children's room was a ballroom,
Okay. Mhm.
Oh,
and that what is currently the director and administrative assistant's office was the law office.
Mhm.
Was used as for the lawyer's office.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that what where our technical services office is right now, we think was the servants' quarters. We
Yeah.
can tell that because the fireplace is very plain and bare bones
Yeah.
compared to the other two fireplaces in the
Right.
building.
Right. One of the things that I wanted to mention, I didn't feel like I had time to go into, was the reason why, this is the first real attempt at a biography of Asher Benjamin, is the lack of documents. He didn't leave much in the way of letters, correspondence, drawings, personal stuff that may have answered some of those questions. So we're left to maybe speculate about some of them, but we can figure some things out, obviously, by just looking at his buildings, and it may be that those wings were added at a later date.
Well, we want to thank you very much for presenting tonight. This was fascinating. It was great. For those of you who may have missed something, we are recording this, and it will be posted to the library's YouTube page sometime in the next couple of days. We will put an announcement out on our Facebook page when that happens. And I just want to thank Bill for being here with us tonight. Oh, got a chat message. Let me take someone said, thanks, Bill, great
Yes.
job. So thank you all for being here tonight. I'm going to stop the recording. Thanks again also to the Greenfield Public Library.
Yes.
And take a look for it on